Okay, so I'm Adam Rabinowitz. I'm one of the 4 PIs of the Stories of Ancient Resilience flagship project for Planet Texas. And I will be dividing presentation with Cheryl Leziter-Beach and Dan Breeker, who are 2 of the other 3 PIs. Melissa Kemp, who is the 4th, is not able to join us today. So I'll cover her side a little bit inexpertly, but I will do my best. So we wanted to begin by, as Tim and Rise did, by reminding ourselves and any viewers of what our basic mission is. And our project is really meant to rethink the way that we consider human resilience. And I'll give an example. I think that human resilience is often imagined like a rubber band. So a rubber band, if it's stretched too far, breaks, and then you throw it in the trash. And when we think about the past and human response to crisis, a resilient society, a resilient community, a resilient situation is one that when stretched, then snaps back to its original form and can still be used as the same rubber band. And a society that is not able to snap back breaks and disappears. And that's our collapse narrative. And we all feel that that is much too simple a way to look at the human past, because in all of those cases, people kept going, people lived through those events, people continued on, societies managed to preserve parts of themselves without necessarily snapping back to their original form. And we feel like looking forward, the way that we imagine the future can't be in those 2 categories of either we go right back to where we were, whatever set point we have in 1985, and just keep doing that, or we go into a dystopian post-apocalyptic nightmare in which everybody is eating each other. So we want to think about different ways to envision human response to stressors, especially climate stressors, and especially changes in demographic composition and where populations are over time, because these are 2 things that face Texas, obviously, and 2 of the motivating factors for Planet Texas overall. We also want to consider the fact that it might be that the rubber band breaks, but it serves a different purpose, takes on a different form, is something equally valid as a broken rubber band or a rubber band that you tie together again, which I've been guilty of doing, and not something that you just write off as a failure, as a collapse. And furthermore, it is pretty clear that resilience is often used in a way that blames the rubber band for breaking. So if your rubber band breaks, it wasn't resilient enough, it should have been more resilient. And this leaves out the question of who is doing the stretching of the rubber band and whether that stretching itself is something that we should consider as a problem. So our project as a whole has tried to engage with finding other ways to define or explore resilience, working with stakeholder groups, starting with the Institute of Indigenous Culture, the Indigenous Cultures Institute in San Marcos, to think about other ways of describing resilience, and then carrying out empirical research into the human past over long periods of time to try to understand how human communities deal with challenges and what the long-term patterns related to those coping strategies end up being. And we've decided to focus that research after our first year of workshops and conversations on finding ways to understand the climate in which those past human societies were moving and correlate them with the developments of those societies. And then looking specifically at mobility and migration of both people and the animals in the ecosystems that surround them, and at the management of resources, and particularly the management of water resources in among past communities. And we focused on fairly complex societies with a high degree of urbanization, which is why the areas that we focused on are the Roman Empire, especially in its later stages when it was facing both climate and demographic change, and the Maya world, which went through its own cycle of growth and challenge. So those are the basic principles that we're dealing with. And those are the things that tie together the fairly disparate set of things that we're about to talk about. Can I have the next slide, please, Heidi? So this year, we've focused on trying to strengthen our engagement with our stakeholders and really work on those ideas of resilience that we're trying to explore. We haven't come up with a better term, but we have at least been able to challenge the traditional notion of resilience as bouncing back. And Nana Odom, a graduate student in education under the supervision of Fikile Numalo, who is now at Toronto but was with UT, worked with the Indigenous Cultures Institute and carried out a literature review of the literature of resilience as it is applied to Indigenous and marginalized communities. So how those terms and concepts are used. And we had a workshop in which her research was presented, in which we talked some more about these concepts. In December, the Zotero collection is publicly available. Next slide, please. To continue this issue of stakeholder engagement and of public engagement, we've also been working with folks in the College of Fine Arts in Theater and Dance, following on some drama-informed pedagogical work that Katie Dawson and some of her graduate students have been doing. And this is what I'm describing here. They've been carrying out a series of workshops with local K through 12 students, mainly middle and high school, probably expanding to elementary school in the coming year in Austin and in Round Rock, to have students think about their vision of climate change in the future, write plays or creative assignments about those things, and find the stories of the people in their communities that touch on local knowledge, climate change, and human environment interactions. And we've also been building some artistic collaborations with various local artists, a visual artist named Riel Sturkio, who has been doing a series of graphic works based on the reproduction of prints of small portions of people's skin, which have an uncanny resemblance to some of the imagery of the Earth's skin and surface that we collect through LiDAR. And also with J.E. Johnson again in the College of Fine Arts, to create what we're calling temporarily a climate closet, a sort of an immersive installation where you enter into a space that has the projection of something that you think of as a familiar or home-like landscape with sounds, which is where Tim's project comes in, soundscapes that again recall home and a feeling of location and placement and familiarity, and maybe smells. And then the idea would be that after some amount of time that the person in this experience can engage with that environment, there is a very sudden shift to an unfamiliar place, to emphasize feelings of dislocation and try to help the participant engage with the kinds of dislocation that people who are migrating by choice or by force from one place to another are also forced to experience, to create a sense of empathy. If we could have the next slide, please. And our research is trying to tie some of those things together. The most Texas-based of that is looking at the use and disuse of the acequia system in San Antonio, and how that system formed part of the urban infrastructure, was retracted from the urban infrastructure, and then entered the urban infrastructure again. That whole system is based on Spanish colonial methods of water management, but also on indigenous methods of water management in this part of Texas and down into Central America. We are looking at this from an environmental perspective by looking at trees around those acequias and trying to understand whether the patterns of growth in those trees, which favor wet environments, reflect the disuse of acequias or a continuity of use. And we're also, I think, going to start looking at the botanical and floral patterns around those acequias, which we might be able to compare with botanical arrangements with the vegetation in the past, especially thinking about foodways and plants that are edible, if not cultivated as crops. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the more laboratory science-based component of our research. And that has a number of different elements, but the three that we are highlighting today are ancient DNA research, isotope geochemistry, and hydrological and water and soil research. Melissa Kemp's lab is carrying out aDNA research on both both animal and human specimens. This year, we've had a GRA, a graduate student named Lauren Springs, one of Deborah Bolnick's students, who has been working as a lab manager, helping Melissa to set up that lab for both human and faunal aDNA analysis, and training undergraduate and other graduate students in some other labs so that we'll have capacity to do this kind of aDNA research at UT. Next slide, please. Dr. Kemp's research focuses on especially reptiles and amphibians, and how looking at those groups of animals in archaeological contexts and paleontological contexts across time as some subspecies become extinct or change their range might help us understand past climate and the appearance of past landscapes in Texas. One of the things that Dr. Kemp's lab has been working on is establishing ethical guidelines for the analysis of both human and plant remains. And they worked with our previous postdoc, Angie Locker, to draw up some guidelines that will be appropriate for use if we begin to work with, especially with indigenous groups and descendant communities in Texas. It's a little less of an issue for the Romans that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Next slide, please. So this is the work that Dr. Kemp's lab is doing on the faunal remains, and they've had to develop some new protocols because these remains from amphibians and reptiles are often so small that they don't present enough bone material for the kinds of protocols that are usually used for aDNA. So they're breaking new ground on methods to capture aDNA evidence from very small amounts of material. Next slide, please. That lab is also working on some human remains recovered from the Greek and Roman site of Histria in Romania on the Black Sea coast. Histria was near the mouth of the Danube River, and it was originally a Greek colony, but by the 1st century AD had become a Roman outpost on the Roman frontier, where a lot of movement of people was happening in conjunction with some pretty significant climate changes that happened in the 2nd and especially the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. So this is another laboratory for the reaction of this community to some of these changes over a long period of time. We've been excavating in a Roman cemetery that was used for about 400 years. And in 2021, we were able to recover remains from a collective tomb that contained at least 18 individuals who had been deposited over a number of years. We're waiting for radiocarbon data right now that'll tell us how long that range was. But what we hope is that we have a family group over multiple generations that we can analyze in terms of the aDNA, not only to establish kinship relationships and see how this group changed over time or was integrated into the fabric of this community, but also potentially to look at epigenetic change and inherited stress markers on the genetic level. So there are 4 individuals who are currently being analyzed in Dr. Kemp's lab. Next slide, please. Down the road, we're going to be doing some more extensive sequencing of the human and animal remains. And we are going to be joined by a postdoc who we've finally managed to recruit and hire, Eden Washburn, who is coming out of the University of California, Santa Cruz, and who has experience both in ancient DNA analysis. She works in the high Andes in Peru, and also in isotopic analysis. So she will be a great fit for the range of projects that we're doing, which leads to the next slide, please. And that is isotope geochemistry, where we are using isotopes to understand both human and animal mobility and diet and the connections between the two across landscapes in Texas and in the area of that city of Histria on the Romanian Black Sea coast. And I won't get into details here, but we've been developing an isoscape for Romanian Dobrogea, that area between the Danube and the Black Sea, which will allow us to trace human mobility and animal mobility, we hope, even on a fairly local level with those Roman remains. And we've also been developing some methods to try to recover paleoclimate data from human and animal bone buried in soil, and the quantity of bacterial lipids from particular colonies of bacteria associated with decay. And I have to qualify, because Tony mentioned that the isoscape is cool, that what you're looking at, the colors are actually the geological substrates. We haven't made the real isoscape with the heat mapping, but you can see the isotopic values of strontium from water, strontium from minerals, and oxygen from water running across that landscape. Next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn things over to Dan Breeker, whose light isotope lab is where a lot of that isotopic analysis is happening, and who is also working on a project to understand paleoclimate from the isotopic profiles of snails.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I wanted to talk about some results that we have gotten really recently that I'm quite excited about. And this is relevant to the vegetation in Texas and how it's changed through time. And so the idea here is to use faunal remains, snail shells, to tell us something about the distribution of plants in the past, with the ultimate objective of combining that with our records of where people lived in the past to try to get at that relationship. And so what I'm showing now is just some previous work where people sampled snail shells from a transect across Texas. There's the map on the left, and they make this measurement, which is basically the ratio of two isotopes of carbon, carbon 13 to carbon 12. It's shown here as delta C13 on the vertical axis of the plot on the right. And the plot shows that that varies with the percentage of the land surface that's covered by plants, the canopy cover. And you know, I guess the thing to notice, can you just next slide, is that there's actually quite a large range. Oop, back one, back two. There's quite a large range. There you go. In these carbon isotope compositions of snail shells, even from a canopy cover over there on the right, where it's boxed in red, is 100%. And so if you just advance, so we have collected some samples of snail shells. This is from the Turkey, around near the Turkey Creek Trail, if anyone ever takes their dogs walking there. And they're all from a single species. You know, there's some various sizes here. We made these carbon isotope measurements, and what we notice is that if you look at the plot in the middle there, there's a lot of the snails have sort of an intermediate delta C13 value. Some of them have a low value all the way on there on the left, somewhere around -14 per mil. And then there's, you know, one that's way off on the right, and we call this a skewed distribution. And I think that probably the best way to explain this, and we know this is the case, that some snails actually eat not just plant material, but they eat limestone. And the limestone, now we're on the plot all the way on the right, the limestone has a very high delta C13 value, whereas plants, the range there is shown, have lower delta C13 value. So if there's a few snails that are eating a lot of limestone, that might explain their very high delta C13 values. And that's not then going to tell us much about the vegetation. What we want is we want to be able to remove those snails that are the limestone ingesters and just consider the ones that are eating the plants. And so the plan is to make some radiocarbon measurements of these samples and look at the relationship between the radiocarbon in the snail shells and the C13, C12 ratios. And that's going to tell us about the amount of limestone that the snails have eaten, because the limestone has 0 radiocarbon in it. It's very old. All the radiocarbon has decayed, whereas the plants are very young and they have relatively high radiocarbon levels. So the idea is to eventually be able to use the radiocarbon to screen and decide what values we should use to interpret for making maps of paleovegetation. So just one more slide. Right, the idea here is actually this is a project that was completely, it wouldn't have happened without this initiative. It's not something that I was working on before starting to talk with some of the archaeologists here, and realizing that actually in the archaeological collections there are huge quantities of snails that no one's using, and thinking about, oh, maybe we can use these snails. This is the picture in the middle. Those are the fossil snails or the ancient snails to say something about how vegetation across Texas has changed through time. And as we know, right, there's a really big vegetation gradient across our state. But what we don't know is how that changed in the past and how that relates to where people lived in the past. So that's sort of the bigger picture of where we're going with this. And I don't know, actually, I'm not sure. Am I passing it to Cheryl now? Yeah. Okay, good.
Yes, thanks, Dan. And when you're done with all those snails from Texas, we have quite a few down in Belize we've collected as well. And we'll see if they eat the limestone there too. But that might help resolve some issues. Well, speaking of limestone landscapes, we have been working across the Mesoamerican corridor, looking at mapping and modeling ancient landscapes. Our story of ancient resilience takes place in the ancient Maya world, and we have been working for many, many years in cooperation with the Program for Belize Archaeological Project. I'm really happy that Dr. Fred Valdez, the director of the project, is here today. He's one of our long and loyal Planet Texas partners in studying past societies and ancient resilience. So the latest phase in our project has been to analyze laser or LiDAR mapping that we conducted in 2016 as a consortium of different researchers, mainly at UT, but also in cooperation with colleagues at University of Puerto Rico and at University of Tyler, Texas. What we're trying to do is use the LiDAR to sort out ancient infrastructure that is both urban, so that's the typical, the archaeology side, but also agricultural infrastructure, which is also archaeology, but also of particular interest to we geographers and hydrologists and soil scientists who are interested in ancient waterworks and how people engineered the landscape to be able to achieve farming to feed their populations. So we've been working on upscaling what we know about the extent, the geographical extent of these ancient wetland farming fields, and comparing them with other research on contribution of ancient agriculture to a proposed early Anthropocene. So how does farming contribute in terms of greenhouse gases, for instance, to change the atmosphere? And we found that based on what we only knew from field work, is about just a fraction. It's 5 to 10% of what we really know from experimenting with LiDAR as to how much infrastructure is out there. So we can use these rediscovered landscapes to scale up from other projects in Mexico and Guatemala and elsewhere in the Americas to scale up the amount of humanization, the amount of landscape alteration that's happened, especially in regards to agriculture. This wetland farming is seen as an ancient adaptation to environmental change and population need. And so, as Adam said, we may not be snapping the rubber band back to exactly as how it was, but when ancient farming surfaces, dryland farming surfaces get inundated with groundwater from rising sea levels, people got busy and dug ditches and built fields and reclaimed the land. It wasn't the same as before, but it was, as far as we can see from our ecofacts and artifacts, productive farmland at a time of increasing drought and water insecurity. So this is looking at how people do respond, and may not in exactly the same way, but to continue in a resilient way. The latest step is that our students are now using the remote sensing and LiDAR to train artificial intelligence models to also model land use change and to model hydrology and water flow in these ancient structures. And so our graduate students have been working on land use change in modern Northwestern Belize, in addition to ancient Northwestern Belize, to get at these issues of conversion of farmland and conversion of forests and conversion of wetlands and what that resulting landscape is. Now, we will have a new mission to collect LiDAR in Northwestern Belize. This is planned for mid-2022, but that's very COVID access dependent, because flying airplanes in foreign countries takes a lot of levels of permissions, from civil aviation to homeland security to archaeology. So we're working with a consortium of folks from UT, NCOM, which is at University of Houston, the National Center for Airborne Laser Mapping, with UT San Antonio, Texas Tech, and UT Tyler partners. Next slide, please. So we're also working underground, in addition to above the ground, making excavations into soils and wetlands. And so another aspect of this work coming out of the Beach Bootser labs and the Breaker labs and our archaeology lab partners is a study of soil and wetland carbon sequestration to get a look at ancient and modern contexts of soil carbon isotope ratios, total organic carbon, the delta carbon 13 that Dan was presenting before in ancient Mesoamerican agriculture. And as Dan indicated, the delta carbon 13 ratios help us to understand the kind of land cover, whether it's ancient forest or ancient agriculture, from those ratios of different carbon isotopes that are left behind after long-term exposure or long-term interaction with plant landscapes. We're combining this with modeling of our wetland farming spatial extent to then get an idea of potential greenhouse gas inputs and how much impact perhaps Mesoamerican or broader agricultural activities, ancient agricultural activities contributed to that early Anthropocene. We're also continuing to build capacity in the Beach Bootser labs for carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur analysis. Our PhD students, our GRAs, and our SOAR GRAs are all working on various aspects of these projects, including Will Pratt, who is our current SOAR GRA and lab manager, kind of leading the way on all this coordination. But many others who are both current students and also Planet Texas former GRAs, alumni of the program, and training undergrads as well. I'd also like to note that we had a session on soil carbon isotopes at the Geological Society of America that Dr. Breaker and Tim Beach and myself, among others, also presented papers on some of these results. Next, please. And then in my third and final example, we're also applying the resilience concepts of SOAR to again bring back and inform the modern context. So SOAR faculty and former GRA from PT 2050 are applying these concepts to emerging deglaciated landscapes in terms of ecologies and hydrologies, working to develop international steward protocols. This one is called High Call for High Mountain Calls to Action for Landscapes and Livelihoods, to include local community stakeholders and to understand that it is a changing landscape, but if we work early and hard enough, we can find ways to capture water and to better manage emerging ecosystems in these new landscapes. Next, please. So I'd like to thank you all for your time and your attention, and just listing the co-PIs of our project, that we represent sort of the tip of the iceberg, or the glacier, as it were, in terms of our broader group working on past societies and resilience. And I'm happy to stop for your questions. Thank you.